Hello and welcome to the tour of our 3D model of a medieval feudal manor. We are Otto, Quintin and Luke. Our manor was based on the northern England at York. York was a small place with a river going through it. It was way smaller than it is now and it had less citizens. According to history of York, York was an intruding, colorful, smelly and thrilling place to be for much of the Middle Ages. Many iconic buildings in York date from the Middle Ages. We will go through a 3D Minecraft build of our manor and film it while giving all the information about it. We will talk about several aspects of the manor. When we talk about the buildings, we will tell why we built the things the way they are built, by giving evidence and showing pictures on what they are based on. These are our works cited lists. We used many sources for every topic to compare them and make sure our facts were right.
My part of this project is about cultural and how culture was in the medieval manor. This includes the housing, the food, and more. The housing and the food differed over the different social classes. People with more money could eat meat and other more expensive foods, but people with less money would not be able to buy those sorts of food. The only thing they could buy was crops they grew themselves or very cheap vegetables that no one liked. People also had different eating habits in that time. As in the beginning of the Middle Ages, they would only eat 2 meals a day. But later on the peasants started eating 30. They think this happens because they started working more per day. They would need more energy and thus food to be able to work the whole day. When you would look at the houses, you could definitely see a difference between rich people and poor people. Rich people could afford better and larger houses. Peasants got sick because their houses were not very windproof. And when they got sick, the doctors could not do a lot because they were not very skilled at that time. Most of the time they gave the patient rest as advice, not because it would work, but also because they could not do a lot more. The Manor House. The Manor House is a house or castle overseeing the village. This house or castle most of the time owned by a king or high-ranking official. This would be where the villagers in time of war would hide, but it would also be where everything happened. It was kind of the city hall. A manor had multiple bedrooms and had all the necessities so that the king or queen would have a pleasant stay in their castle. They would have the best meals and they would treat it the best by their staff. They would have a library and a big kitchen. Then the main hall where everything happened. Here they could have feasts and have places for the peasants on the lower tables and places for the high-ranking officials on the higher tables.
The whole period of the Middle Ages can be divided into 2 eras when talking about medieval housing. Nowadays we call these 2 periods the early or dark Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages. Housing in these 2 eras was very different to each other. In the early Middle Ages, for example, many parts and states in Europe were still recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire. There was a lot of chaos because suddenly a lot of land was not possessed by the Romans anymore. In this period, independent groups like the Vikings saw their chances to conquer or claim land and started battles with people who wanted to do the same. These independent groups are the main reason for the building method in the early Dark Ages, which was based on tactical protection strategies and building structures which were easy and fast to recover or to reconstruct. Hereby, the buildings were built less complicated and with less neatness, so that it wouldn't be much of a problem when buildings got destroyed in a war. When the Roman Empire ruled and owned most part of Europe, all states and land was very organized. There were less wars in Roman territories, and so the buildings were more complex and almost impossible constructions for the time, because there were no threats from outside. They didn't have many things or problems to worry about compared to the Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages, on the other hand, had to deal with battles and fights. because there was no peace as in a very organized Roman Empire anymore. So in the Middle Ages, they downgraded the aesthetics of new structures, built uneven wall structures of stone and straw huts with mud and sticks for the peasants, in order for practical protection and to defend themselves. When people got settled down, landowners were able to pay the peasants more money and to provide more jobs for them, and so they started upgrading their houses and lands. This period was the late Middle Ages. Our period, the 12th century, is in the nearly end of the early Middle Ages and the beginning of the late Middle Ages. So this means that the manors and kingdoms were already developing better, neater and more complex building methods. But some really poor people still couldn't afford better housing and still lived in straw, mud and stick houses made by themselves.
The peasants used to have wattle and daub houses, which were taller and wider than the stick, mud and straw houses from the poor. Also, often your materials depended on where you live. For example, some houses were made out of flintstone found in a nearby environment. Some houses were made out of cobblestone, and the typical peasant houses out of woven twice with mud. This was cheaper since they didn't have to import these materials for their houses from other places around the globe. This was also the reason why bricks were more expensive, because not every noble person had the access to clay. And producing bricks requested a lot of energy, time and manual labor to make, making it an expensive product. Because the church was so rich, the materials used were often more expensive. For example, the church was the only building in a manor with roof tiles and with stained glass. The church also used a neater kind of stone than just cobblestone with different sizes. Also, the chandeliers were unique compared to other buildings in the manor.
A peasant generally worked 2 to 3 days a week on the Lord's land, but when it was planting or harvest day, they spent more time working on the Lord's land. A peasant usually worked 8 hours a day on the Lord's land. Not only peasants were farmers, but there were also other important jobs that had to be done. For example, there were blacksmiths who made weapons and tools like axes, scissors and swords. You had armorers that made armor for the Lord like chest plates, helmets, shoes. You had lumberjacks who chopped trees on the permission of the Lord for building structures and houses for the peasants and for the noble people. You had the bakers who baked breads. You had millers who grind the corn from the land. And you had butchers who killed the animals and produced meat for the peasants. You can also see that a lot of towns, villages and manors and cities are located near a river. For example, York has a river crossing right through the middle, and London also has a river crossing right through the middle. A river was ideal for farming, not only for farming but also for creating energy. Even though they didn't have cables and electronics, they sometimes just simply built a water mill in the river to get hydropower, which means power generated by power of the water stream. This was often used by farmers as a way to grind corn, as shown in the video, when they didn't have a river nearby. Not every farmer on the land farmed. There were many tasks available among the farmers. For example, you could do planting, ploughing, fertilizing, sowing and weeding. Weeding was very important on land when the seeds started to grow. It became a daily job, and children, men and women all had to join forces. If the weeds were allowed to grow, they would cause shadows and prevent light from reaching the seeds. Last but not least, yet the bird carriers, who scared off birds and prevented them from stealing seeds. The most difficult time for getting food was the end of spring. This was when food stores were running out and new food was not growing yet. When the harvest failed or they farmed not much, it would mean some people or families would starve to death.
Now I'm going to talk about the religious aspect of the manor. Everybody in the manor was religious and were Christians. Everybody prayed and visited the church often, sometimes once a week or sometimes more. It did not matter in what social class you were or how much money you had to go to the church. When building the church, I got inspiration from this picture for the outside and this picture for the inside. I made it out of the same materials and shapes of the pictures. My building is a bit bigger than the pictures because York was a more civilized place in that time. They paid 10% of what they earned per year to the church as a tax called tithes. Tithes could be paid in either money or in goods produced by the peasant farmers. Nowadays, not many people visit the church weekly, and the religion has a much smaller role in their lives. There are also many people without a religion or religion other than Christianity everywhere around the world. These two pictures teach us that the priest and the religion had power over the citizens. It shows that they could scare people and therefore make them do things. Their power could do this to normal peasants, but even to very powerful kings, by threatening them.
Politics. In the feudal manor, there were many different classes, yet all the different people who lived in the houses that were meant for their class. Classes did not just mean what house, but also which food they had and what they did as a job. You had the peasants. They were like slaves and worked on the land of the nobles and got paid just enough to sustain their families. They lived in small houses. Then you would go to the nobles. They would borrow the land from the king and make the peasants work on it for a nice profit. You had people in the middle, such as very rich farmers. They would own a bit of own land and would sometimes have their own crops. Then we arrive at the king or queen, the one with all the power and most of the time the owner of all the land. They would have the final say in what the crops were going to be and how the army was going to react to threats. Back to the peasants. There were 3 types of peasants, all with a different type of life. You had the slaves, who could be bought by people. Then you had the serfs, who could not do anything as they had no political rights. And then we would arrive at the freedmen. These were peasants who sometimes owned a little shop or a bit of land. This was all in the feudal manor system. There were, of course, laws. These laws were made by the king or queen and were enforced by the army. You had a court in a medieval manor. Sometimes the king or queen would be the judge, but you also had appointed judges who would do cases. The punishments ranging from death to put in a block whilst people are throwing rotten tomatoes at you.
Rich people in the Middle Ages were able to import carpets from the East. They were too expensive and valuable just to lay them on the ground, so they hanged them up on their walls, or more commonly, they were laid on tables, as shown on page 64 in the book called The Middle Ages.
Fences around the fields. The farms were shielded by wooden fences around the fields. This was because the animals living in the woods could destroy the crops. Also, by placing fences, they created sections in the farm. This was handy for a couple of reasons. When harvesting or planting, the farmers could know which sections they had already finished. Coat of arms. As you can see, there are flags everywhere. The flags include the colors yellow, red and white. Although you are not able to use too much detail in Minecraft, we based the design of the flag on the original Yorkshire coat of arms. This flag was used to show which parts, buildings or farms belonged to certain manors, in this case York. Water basin. Almost every family used to have a water basin in their house. This was located next to the fireplace, since the fire would warm up the water so you could clean yourself. Lighting of houses. Since the roof of houses were made out of straw, torches were not a good idea, since it could set the roof on fire. For this reason, the houses would only use the natural lighting from outside, and in the dark also use the fireplace. Throughout researching, writing and designing our feudal manor, we've discovered many things. For example, we found out that the church has the most power of the whole manorial system. Also, there's a huge impact on the citizens since they have to pay taxes to the church. The economic factors are important to the manor. Most importantly, the manorial system itself. The politics in the time limited the rights of the citizens. An important part of the feudal system was the division of different social classes. Also, we've learned about the cultural aspects of the feudal manor, like the houses. They differed from sizes and materials depending on your financial situation. What was the role of feudalism in the evolution of the European society? The feudal system summarizes the economic, political, and social systems of the manor and kingdoms. Let's go back to its origins. Europe in the early Middle Ages was weak and was threatened by independent groups like the Vikings. The king needed to share the land among his nobles to lessen his responsibility. This system can be compared to that of the social classes. First, on top of the pyramid, the king was established in the highest rank. Then the nobles followed. After that, the knights came. And lastly, the peasants and serfs were located on the bottom. Feudalism was based on an exchange of land, money and protection. By dividing the land, the king could control his land better. Throughout this project, we've learned a lot of new things about York during the Middle Ages. We've enjoyed it and it was a great experience. We loved it that we were allowed to create a 3D representation of the manor and express our knowledge in this way.